Hey everybody, my name is Philip Shepard. I'm a local real estate agent located right here in Northwest Arkansas. And today we're talking about something very specific when it comes to real estate. How are transactions here in Arkansas different than other parts of the country? So let's talk about that. But before we begin, if you could like this video and also subscribe, that would make the world of difference. I try to produce as much content as humanly possible about Northwest Arkansas. And so making sure that you liking the videos and also subscribing, make sure that my content goes in front of the right people at the right time looking to move here. So thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it. All right, so this is like a very, very specific video about real estate transactions comparison to Illinois, because that's where I came from. So in case you weren't aware, I moved here from Chicago land, and also I was a real estate broker up in Chicago for a long, long time. So I'm used to the whole wheelins and dealins of Chicagoland politics, all the fun stuff of Illinois. So glad to get out of there, and let's talk about some of the interesting differences about Arkansas. So the biggest difference, and I love this difference the best, is the fact that in Arkansas, we don't use attorneys on real estate transactions really at all. They're just not needed. Now in Illinois, maybe this is if you're coming from California or potentially like some of the Pacific Northwest or other parts of America, oftentimes there's attorneys actually on both sides of the parties on the contract. Illinois, this is one of them. And so there are some differences between the two. Like in Illinois, it was a little bit harder to get transactions together and also like get them to the closing table, because attorneys oftentimes don't really necessarily care about getting the deal done per se. They're mostly, obviously making sure that the law is followed, etc. So when it came to like any sort of transactional talking between people, it was done between attorneys a lot of times, and it just didn't work out super well. So removing attorneys from the actual real estate contract makes a big difference. And one of the big differences between Illinois and Arkansas contracts is the fact that Arkansas contracts there's so many different actual addendums and things built into the contract itself. So you don't really necessarily need an attorney to actually do real estate here in Arkansas. So the fact is that there's no attorneys here. It makes contracts and everything a lot easier, because attorneys, they don't make the process easier, to say the least, obviously. So there's no attorneys used in Arkansas most of the time when it comes to real estate transactions. So I am okay with that, to say the least. Secondly is the fact that we don't use earnest money here in Arkansas. So if you're coming from like Illinois, we used earnest money a lot. California, a lot of other states, including like the Carolinas, they use earnest money. Essentially, if you don't know what earnest money is, it's basically just giving like a check that is agreed upon amount of money after the contract's agreed upon. You give it to the brokerage, and they hold on to it kind of in a separate account until the closing table. Now, one of the differences here is the fact that in Arkansas, we use something called non-refundable deposits. And what that essentially is, the only differences, honestly, is that the actual check goes to the actual seller themselves versus getting held in some sort of like special fund on the side until closing table. So it makes it a little bit less red tape-ish. I prefer that, obviously, but there is no earnest money when it comes to Arkansas. That's one of the differences here. Kind of the same concept, a little bit of nuance, but really it's kind of the same concept, just a little less red tape, essentially. That reminds me, I have a 3-day itinerary. So maybe you're coming down here and you're quickly realizing there's so much to do in Northwest Arkansas, because there is. I have a 3-day itinerary linked below. So maybe you're a foodie, maybe you're a sightseer, maybe you have kids, maybe you're an adventurer. Go ahead and download my 3-day itinerary linked below and just use it for when you come down here. Speaking of which, when you do come down here, definitely give me a call, because I can give you the $10 tour, kind of show you around the whole area. We can check out some homes for sale or for rent and see how far your dollar will go in Northwest Arkansas compared to where you're coming from. And thirdly, and this is probably one of the biggest differences versus Illinois versus Arkansas, and probably a lot of other places in America, is the fact that there aren't a lot of surveys used here. So when I first moved down here years ago, one of the things that I quickly realized when I bought my first house was the fact that like I asked for a survey, because I'm like, yeah, that's what you do. In Illinois, we get a new survey. We get new surveys all the time. Yeah, not here in Arkansas. And so a lot of times if you ask for a survey, they're just gonna be like, look at the plat map or look at like what was done previously. So, and I think part of it is, this is just speculation. Surveys here are a little bit more expensive than Illinois and other places. And on top of that, there's not as many surveyors here as there would be in Illinois. So the price kind of goes up with that. And so there really isn't necessarily a need, because once you have your pins locked in on the different properties, or whether you're in a subdivision or if you have land, those pins are marked there. And oftentimes sellers don't want to pay for a survey because they're expensive. So it's one of those things where if you want it to be surveyed, you take care of it after the fact. And on top of that, if you are buying a home in a subdivision, like 95% of the time it's going to have a fence around it. So your kind of property line is defined by the fence. And so like fence lines can run, actually all the time, they run on the actual property line itself. Where in Illinois, a lot of times you'd have to put the fence line like 5 or like 3 feet inside the property line. So it became kind of annoying. So I can understand in Illinois why you would want to have a survey because you're like, where's my property line? Is the fence in the property line? Is it outside the property? We don't know. So in Arkansas, the property line runs along with the fence oftentimes, and they allow that here. In comparison to Illinois, they didn't really allow that. They didn't like that so much. And so cities would kind of, stop that, and they'd say 5 feet here, 10 feet here. So it got annoying up in Illinois for sure. So that's one thing you'll quickly realize when you do buy property in Arkansas, they don't really do surveys a lot here. They don't really offer them in contracts a lot of times. So number 4 is kind of a summary of the previous ones. And this is like the idea is that everything's a little bit more easygoing here. Whether it's the contracts, the lack of surveys, etc. Things are just a little bit more easygoing. So there's a lot less tension. Maybe where I came from, it was high tension, like high pressure, earnest money, attorneys. Like it just was, it was a good time to say the least. Ugh. But in Arkansas, it's a lot easier going. Things are a lot smoother here because the contracts, I would argue, a lot more solid, and they're written by attorneys for real estate agents and brokers to use down here. And so a lot of times the contracts just kind of speak for themselves. They're a lot easier to use. Whereas in Illinois, like if there was an addendum, if there was a change to the contract, attorney would have to draft that up. And so it makes the whole process a lot easier down here because there's already those contracts already done, like those addendums are already done, so that if there's like let's say a little hindrance in the contract or the process, we can just write something up in the actual contract with an addendum itself and just get it signed. Whereas in other states and other places, an attorney has to draft that, it becomes a whole thing and blah 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 blah. So long story short, things are a lot easier going down here because they've seen the problems of other states and other ways of doing things, and they're trying to avoid them, which I appreciate, to say the least. And last but certainly not least, if you are from like California, Illinois, and other places that have basements, there are no radon tests here. No radon tests really at all. There are a couple basements up in Bella Vista and some other places, but usually they're walkout basements. But there is really no radon test here at all in Arkansas. So, but we don't really have carpenter ants per se. We don't have radon tests because there's really no basements. And radon is a gas that's emitted oftentimes in a basement because it's underground, like it's a whole thing. But one thing to counteract that is we do have every Arkansas home that's sold in Arkansas, except unless it's cash, the mortgage is the fact that we have to have a termite policy. So someone has to come out to the house, check for termites, check for pests, and they just make sure that gives a thumbs up to say, yes, there's no termites here in this house. So essentially it's kind of the same thing as radon, except radon's a lot more challenging, a lot more expensive, potentially expensive. And so down in Arkansas, we actually use termite policies a lot of times. And so that's kind of the differences there when it comes to some of the real estate contracts here in Arkansas. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. Really appreciate you guys watching. Again, if you are thinking about moving down to Northwest Arkansas, download my 3-day itinerary link below. Maybe you're an adventurer, maybe you're a sports person, maybe you have kids, maybe you're a sightseer, maybe you're a foodie like me. Download my 3-day itinerary link down below because there's one for you. Also, when you do come down here, we can check out some homes for sale or for rent and see how far your dollar will go in Northwest Arkansas compared to where you're coming from. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next one.